Welcome to this episode of Midlife Men with me, Philip Briscoe. In this episode, I am joined by Dave Cohen. Dave is a comedian, a broadcaster. He's a TV writer, and you may recognise many of his horrible history songs. He's also a very respected teacher of comedy writing, and I can vouch for that, being a previous student. He's also written lots of books about comedy. But he's also written some novels as well about a character called Barry Goldman. There's a trilogy of those books, so you can go and have a look for those online. So welcome, Dave.
Hi, Philip. Hi, thanks for your kind words.
Great. Well, what we're talking about today is less about comedy and more about it's relevant to your life as a comedian, but it's more about the context of family relations, and particular the relationship between children and their parents, or children as they grow into adulthood and beyond and their parents. And be really interested to hear about your story. So I'm going to hand over to you, Dave, actually, because you can kind of start at the beginning.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad you didn't say any more about that, because there is only really one subject I'm an expert on with regard to that, and that's my relationship with my parents. I really, really know more about that than anyone else. I am an absolute authority in that area. Although my brother and sister may differ, they may have very different views of how they were brought up, which is actually quite an interesting starting point, I think, because I come from the north of England, provincial city called Leeds, which had a small but very, very tight-knit Jewish community, and we all lived very close by. We all knew each other, and there were a lot of people were related to each other. All my family all lived really, really close by, and they came from they were great. My grandparents and great grandparents had come over from Eastern Europe and Russia. They fled from Russia and the pogroms at that time, and found their way, I think accidentally found their way to Leeds. I think they were told they were going to New York, and they got on the boat at St. Petersburg, and were assured that this stretch of land that they were arriving at, once they sort of got through the Baltic and were crossing in absolute record time, they'd already made it to New York. It turned out to be Hull. So Hull is nice. It's a nice enough place, really, but it's not New York. And so that's already the kind of starting point, is where I'm in my 60s now. So we kind of grew up in my parents lived through the period of the Holocaust. They'd ended up, and they were both born in Leeds, but their families had come from elsewhere. And so they had this thing in the background, the Holocaust, and my dad had fought in the war as well. So they had the war, the Holocaust, and then the setting up of the State of Israel. And so the narrative that we were always told about, really, was the sort of fantasticness of the State of Israel, and very, very little was said about the Holocaust or about how the State of Israel was set up. So there's already sort of a lot of secrecy, mystery around my upbringing, and my family didn't lose family in the Holocaust, but I knew lots of people who had lost all their relatives in the Holocaust. So it was a slightly baffling thing to grow up around, really. And I think that starting point was already something that kind of dealing with my identity, I suppose. And I think a great deal of issues where people have when they're talking about mental health is about where they're from and and where they're going. And I think I spent too much of my time, right, inordinate amounts of time, I suppose, really, kind of trying to find answers to the future by looking at the past. And I think that was the sort of starting point. I mean, and it did lead to quite a lot of difficulty in my relationship with my parents, and I was quite combative with my dad, who was furiously pro-Israel. And this is in the 1970s, for the first time that people are starting to get a little bit sort of concerned about how the Israeli government deals with their neighbours. So this became my kind of teenage identity. Really, was this kind of anti-Israel, and I, being a teenager, I kind of rejected most of the things that I'd grown up with, as in being told that Israel was the perfect place, and a lot of my kind of Jewish culture. I mean, I could never hide my Jewishness. My surname Cohen, my nose large, and plus the fact that I enjoyed performing and liked going out and playing folk clubs and singing silly songs. So there was no way I was ever going to be able to deny my Jewishness, but I became quite sort of strongly against Israel, and that became a sort of big source of battle between me and my parents. And I think that sort of defined a lot of what I felt and how I needed to get away from that, what felt like a very sort of stifling provincial background, and move to London and, you know, seek fame and fortune, fail to get either, but seek averagely successful work as a stand-up comedian in the 1980s.
And how did what did your parents think of this as you started to, go through adolescence and then make your decisions about what you were going to do as a young adult?
Yeah, I mean, that was, to be fair to them, there wasn't a lot of call for stand-up comedy in the 1970s when I was still at school, and in fact, nobody knew what stand-up comedy was really. There was a few people doing it in America, and there was locally it was working class men wearing frilly shirts and bow ties, making jokes about Pakistani people and mothers-in-law. I don't know, never know which one. But and I knew that wasn't what I wanted to do, but I was very taken by a lot of the sort of classic British comedy, really, that resonates across the world, really, I suppose, the kind of Monty Python, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy stuff that was happening around my teenage years. And I had a sense that this was the direction I wanted to go in. And I think all parents would be a little bit worried if their child says, "Oh, that's what I'm going to do." I mean, even more so now, the idea that you can get a job as a creative person, really. I mean, it's just so difficult to get any work at all as a writer or a performer or both, really. But it was what I wanted to do. But my family, again, talk about the family business was everything really to our family, and we were all our lives were sort of tied into that. And my mum's family had a separate family business, but that was kind of not the one that I would be involved with, because I was the son of my father's son, and it was my father's business, and his father before him, and his father before him. So it was just sort of assumed that was where I would go. And I was kind of determined not to, but at the same time resigned to the possibility that it would happen. Then the firm went bust. So that kind of resolved it all for me, really. So good news, I don't have to go into the family business. The bad news, my family are broke.
What was, in a parallel universe, what was it that you were going to be doing then? What was your alternative career?
A clothing manufacturer. So all through the north of England in the 1970s, all the clothing industries disappeared. The great, they've been in decline really since the Second World War, and all first of all in Lancashire, the cotton mills and places, they all sort of died out in the 50s and 60s. And then in Leeds in the 60s and 70s, a lot of clothing manufacturers, but then lots of cheap imports started to come in from Taiwan, and so people were just not buying British clothes. So all these big businesses, a few of them stayed. There's a company called Burton that stayed for a long time in Leeds. They were very successful, but almost all of the other ones, including lots of Jewish firms. So I knew a lot of these people. The Jewish community just lost its main source of income very, very quickly. So that was a thing that sort of disappeared really very quickly.
So I guess fortunate then that you hadn't gone into the business. But did at any point do you have a discussion where you said, well, I told you I didn't want to do it, that wouldn't be a good idea? Or I imagine it was quite difficult times for your parents then.
Yeah, I suppose I was about 14 or 15, and my dad's dad, who was still occasionally going into the business, but he kind of pretty well retired really. So he would have been in his 70s at this point, and he would be saying, come on, when are you starting? And we need you in there now. And I sort of got, I sort of smiled and things. And then we got home and I said to my dad, I said, look, I'm not, it's just, I write love poetry for God's sake, as all teenage boys did, I'm sure. I said, I just can't envisage. And I had worked there, done summer jobs and things, cutting patterns and being in the factory. And so I sort of knew what the factory work was like, but I said, I can't imagine a single thing that you do there that I could really do. And it was actually my mum who said, well, okay. My dad was more sort of upset about it, I think, but my mum, who was probably also upset, but didn't show it. And she just said, look, it's not, maybe that's not the thing for you to do. And I think we're starting to be a little bit more around the 70s there. They had friends. I mean, no one had been to university and things. So they had friends whose kids were starting to go to university. So they were starting to see a little bit that actually there's more to life than doing this job. But I think they were very, there's a lot. I left a lot of things in my teenage years. So the business went bust. The Jewish community in Leeds, it was diminishing. I left that Jewish community. I left whatever supporting Israel aspects of my life. I left that. These were all things that were quite upsetting for my parents, I think, really. And I think I was aware that I was upsetting them, but I think also I felt this. I think even then I knew that from a mental health point of view, even though nobody ever talks about mental health in those terms, I think I probably had a more sort of robust approach. And it might have been because the family firm went bust and I was sort of quite young and having to earn money while I was a student. And so I kind of became quite practical and I could see how, well, actually, I can do bar jobs and that'll pay the bills, and then I can be trying to do comedy, in my spare time or whatever it is, because alternative comedy, as it's now called, didn't exist at that point.
Do you think that, retrospectively, do you think that experience, in your teenage years, do you think that that you carried that, and perhaps it came out in some of the work, some of the comedy and the writing that you've subsequently done?
Absolutely. It was it was my USP, really, I would say, I think, for years and years. The other point to mention as well, the other coincidence, I think, of this time is the arrival of punk. And punk was a sort of, and I was the absolute perfect age for it. I was about 17 or 18. I mean, actually, I think kids who were 13 and 14, it was probably the perfect age for them as well, because it came completely, without any, any strings or anything. You imagine you're 13, 14, 15, this music comes along that blows everything else away, and these whole tribes and things start. But I think, so what happened very quickly was punk arrived, and I found a tribe. I was tribeless, really. I wasn't hanging out with Jewish people. I'd moved away from Leeds. I was a student in Bristol. I didn't hang out with Jews. I didn't hang out with pro-Israel people. I didn't hang out with Leeds people. I didn't kind of know where I was going. But then this punk thing, and punk was music mainly, and it was anarchistic, tearing everything else up stuff. But it was also funny. It was just a really big space for people to be funny. So I was doing these sort of comic songs, and I was putting jokes in between, and it just seemed that all the jokes that I could do, again, because I was called Cohen and I had a big nose, and the audience would just know that I was Jewish the moment I walked on. And so all my material, or my best material, it turned out, was about being Jewish. And then it was interesting for most people, because most people didn't really know much about being Jewish. It wasn't like America, where Jewish culture had been sort of fairly dominant for a century, really. I think whether it's the great Hollywood moguls who started the big, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, Columbia, all these big film companies started by the same sort of people that my great grandparents were. They'd fled from Europe, so it was slightly similar. I think they all came from Hungary for some reason. They all ended up in Los Angeles. Oh, no idea how that one worked.
Different boats.
Yeah. But I mean, they didn't even get to New York. Right? Well, obviously there was like a huge Jewish community, and that whole kind of stand-up culture in America was very sort of Jewish. And you had the north of New York, you had the Catskills, you had, I suppose, the equivalent of the blokes with the white frilly shirts and the black bow ties was the Jewish comedians in the Catskills in the north of New York. So, but they obviously they brought with them, as well as humour, they brought that kind of pathos as well, because obviously they'd all fled from Europe. So there's always been that kind of thing about being Jewish and being a Jewish comedian of being, wanting to be liked, needing to be liked, I think. And so that was an extra thing. But at the time in England, nobody really knew anything about Jewish people. Most people I met in the 70s and 80s didn't really know. And I think it's still true now, although more and more people are associating Jews and Israel and Palestine, and more and more people are learning about that. Again, not in a good way for Jews, really. So that's kind of problematic. But I was able to kind of bring a kind of British Jewish thing which nobody else had done. So that really did inform my work. And the more I did, and I started to do radio shows and write scripts and do one-man shows at the Edinburgh Fringe, and they all ended up being about me and my relationship with my dad, about Israel. And the first two novels have largely been about that as well. So it's just something that only now I'm really kind of saying, I can't write about it anymore.
I guess, people like to label people, and people like, as you said, to have a USP, and that does help. Certainly, I guess when you're, at the start of your career. So I guess you were in quite a small pool of kind of punk Jewish comedians at that point in time.
There's it's very small pool. I mean, the thing that I would say as well about that is obviously I had a very niche USP, really. I mean, I didn't have something universal, but actually, it's really interesting to people. I think when they hear something that's a little bit familiar, but not quite, and when also being white but being from an immigrant community, you have a different different viewpoint to people, say, who are not white from other communities, because we blend in a lot easier, but we're still outsiders. So we're kind of better at reflecting people back at them. And you're right, it was a very small. I mean, when I started doing stand-up comedy in Britain in the early 1980s, there were maybe, I don't know, about 50 of us, and I'd say maybe 3 or 4 of those 50 were Jewish, which is massively over proportionate compared to the population of the country. But I'd say there was another 8, 9, 10, 12 or so who were Catholic or lapsed Catholic, and they had a similar thing. They'd kind of grown up with a similar thing to us, which was that they knew they were very different. They knew they didn't fit in. And I mean, that's quite an interesting thing about comedy, and how people end up in comedy who can't find the right sort of tribe to fit into. And they found this in stand-up comedy. And similarly, again, white people, nobody gave them a second look, but they felt their difference through religion, I suppose, through their religious upbringing. And
so that helped you. It helped you in your career, I guess, to have that differentiator then.
Absolutely. And again, talk about belonging in certain tribes. And I think it took me a long, long time to kind of understand the battles that I'd had with my dad, that there were problems that he had with his own tribal belongings that were related to, I think, his own mental health issues. And it's really taken me, took me decades to understand and discover what was going on between me and my dad, and in fact his brother and his parents, my grandparents, and to understand that actually there was probably quite a very strong streak of autism in my family. I'm not saying this lightly, because it's very common now for people to say, "Oh yes, he's a bit autistic," or "Oh yes, we all have a little bit of this." But I think my dad would almost certainly have got an autism diagnosis if he had been born, 40 years later, 50 years later. And I think that's because nobody knew really what autism was when I was growing up, or they'd heard about it, or there was Asperger's, I suppose. And there were kind of, there were descriptions of things that we now know, tick all the boxes of autism, but were never called that. Some links, say, between dyslexia and autism, for instance, or, kids at school who are called stupid and lazy because when a teacher asked a question, they weren't able to answer straight away. And so it was like, so they obviously weren't paying attention. So they were obviously being naughty or lazy or stupid or whatever. And of course, you internalize all that stuff. If a teacher calls you stupid when you're 5 years old or 6 years old, And my dad got a lot of that from his relatives, from my relatives, and from his dad as well. I think it was awful for my dad.
And I think even today things have changed, enormously beyond recognition. But I still think there's a bit of a stigma. There's a bit of an embarrassment factor for people to admit that they're having challenges, or even if it's not to a mental health diagnosis, but they're just not winning. I still think there's a social, bit of a crippling social anxiety around that. At what point did your parents come and see you perform? When was the first time that happened, and how was that?
Oh yeah, that's quite sweet, really, because I ended up, because the firm had gone bust and I was out there earning money my own way and doing my own thing. They weren't really in a position to tell me, oh, you can't do that. And I became a journalist, which was sort of okay. And then I gave up journalism and moved to London and started doing writing and stand-up performing. And they were pretty unhappy about that, to be sure. And but then about a year into my performing career, I was comparing quite regularly at a club in London called Jongleurs, and it was becoming quite a successful club. And there's a Radio 2 DJ. I didn't know he was there at the time, but he was at this gig that I did one night, and on a Friday night, and then on the Monday morning on his radio show, he talked about going to this gig, and he mentioned my name specifically, and he told one of the jokes that I told. And my mum happened to be a big fan of this guy, Ken Bruce, and she rang me up the next day and said, "Oh, you were on the Ken Bruce show." I said, "No, I wasn't." She said, "Yeah, he mentioned you. He did this gig in, at this club, Jongleurs, and he said a joke, and he said you were really funny." Oh, I said, and from that moment on, my mum was absolutely fine with it, because I'd been validated. In fact, years later, I met Ken and told him the story, because it's just such a nice thing. And I was always grateful to him for that, because he validated me to my mum. My dad could never. I started doing shows on things on Radio 4 stuff quite a lot, and my dad was just always very, very critical of everything that I'd ever done, really. And again, this is something that I have a little bit of trouble with, because I teach people how to write comedy, and there's less and less work available, and I try and be as honest about that as possible. I try and say, look, don't be under any illusions, it's really hard. And I kind of, there's a lot, and I try and be positive, and the whole kind of world of teaching generally, even around creativity, is positivity. But I know I'm not alone in this, that quite a few people I know who are much more successful than me as well had parents who were just hypercritical, and there's a large element, I think, of when you part of whatever it takes to succeed over and above being talented and capable and whatever, there's just some little extra bit of residue from childhood of I'll show you. And I would never ever give that advice to someone. It's like, oh, if if somebody showed me something and I didn't like it, or I didn't personally think it was that good, but I wouldn't say, this is rubbish, this is terrible, what do you think you're doing, what are you wasting your time doing this thing for? And that was how my dad was to me, even when I was doing these Radio 4 shows, and you could hear the audience laughing in the background. And he said, I don't understand this. Well, you're not supposed to understand it, really. What's this joke about marijuana? What's that? Well, you're definitely not supposed to understand that. In fact, I'd rather you hadn't heard that.
Was your humour in those shows quite self-deprecating? And therefore, how did your dad especially find that if you were focusing on on being Jewish as your your focus for your comedy?
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, that's a very good point. I was known as the self-deprecating comedian. Basically, I just went on and just did a string of jokes about my self-loathing, my physical appearance, my lack of social skills, my inability to get a girlfriend. I was, it was just interesting because, and again, interesting, and I haven't thought of it in these terms, and until now, you kind of me talking to you about my dad and my act, but actually just remembering what my dad used to say when we were kids about anti-Semitism. He was very, very stridently against anti-Semites. He said, if anyone calls you a name at school and things, he said you should punch them on the nose, and which was incredibly uncharacteristic of him, because he was so sort of mild-mannered and gentle, but this was the one thing that he really, really felt very, very strongly about was, and he was very, very strongly anti-racist, all in all shapes and forms, really. And again, this was sort of a little bit unusual for men of his generation, but obviously that was something that he had picked up. And again, with the surname and the nose, probably he probably got it a lot worse than I did. Growing up in the 20s and 30s, I imagine there was I know there was a huge amount of anti-Semitism around at that time. So, in a sense, I suppose, and I was then also, in addition to criticizing myself, I would then be criticizing Israel. So yes, I think he was pretty upset about most of that stuff. But then it's also quite a complicated thing as well, because I didn't ever want to come across as sounding like a victim in any way. And there was one joke that I used to do, which was about when I was sort of getting fairly successful. I was doing quite well, and I sort of said, I'm a bit worried that I'm going to be known as a bit of a hooray Jaime, which was sort of, hooray Henrys were the thing at the time. And I did that joke one midnight at the show at the Comedy Store, and there was just one laugh that I was able to pick out from the people who were laughing at the joke. And I could just hear, I thought, that's somebody who's laughing at me, not with me. And I could never do that joke again. I just thought, I don't feel like I want people to laugh at me from that point of view. I don't want that at all. That's probably, quite possibly, one of the key reasons why I never became quite as successful a comedian as maybe I could have done, was that I was just a little bit less prepared to do whatever it took to get the laugh, really, I think. Because all comedians say, the laugh, that's all that matters, getting the laugh. But I had that sort of red line. I think it probably did upset my dad. And I don't ever really feel that, we got on fine and it was all okay, up to the point he died. But I think that he, I never really felt that it he understood what I was doing, but I grew fairly sanguine about it, really.
So did he accept it as your profession, and other things, you've consequently done in that kind of area?
Yeah. I mean, it was just, I was doing the work. But to come back to your question that you asked a while ago about when did they first see me, and actually, they did come and see me performing in Edinburgh in the sort of mid-80s and things, and it was sort of okay, but it wasn't brilliant, And so I could see my dad sitting in the audience in pain because I wasn't getting rapturous. It was going perfectly well, but if I'd say a line and it didn't get as big a laugh as I thought maybe it could have done, I'd just move on to the next line. But I could see him sort of, oh no, they were supposed to laugh and they didn't laugh. So, but then in about 1989, I think, so it was 2 years before my mum died. She was quite young when she died. And so they came to see me in Edinburgh, and that was one of my most successful years, 1989. I was doing 2 shows and they were both very successful. And one of the shows was like a sort of play that I'd written. So it wasn't just me being a stand-up. I was there performing with other actors. And I think my dad was much more comfortable with that. He really liked that show. He always talked to me about that, and he always said, "Oh yeah, that was really good." So I think he was just uncomfortable seeing the person that he knew so well being an approximation of me, rather than seeing me acting and being a character in a play. So I think that must have been a lot of what was difficult for him about it.
Do you feel it was it was all kind of good in the end?
I'd love to say, oh yes, and it was all fine and we're all happy, and I think this is where the kind of issue, the mental health thing comes, because I really did feel like I was lucky that I thought of this in my late 20s, but I got to this point. I thought, I've never really had a proper relationship with my parents. I've never really tried to kind of understand them, see things from their point of view, and I think it was really helpful to do this. And I wish I'd done it earlier. And I think I would say that to anyone, really. If you're having a difficult relationship with your parents, just actually really start to see it from their point of view. Even you don't have to agree with it, and you don't have to like what you see, but it's just too easy to, when you're a teenager, to just say, "Oh God, parents, they're so bloody contrary." And I mean, it's interesting now because my part of my hostility, I suppose, towards Israel was really formed by my dad's hostility to me having any view other than his about it. And he was so, his thinking was so black and white on this, that so he was so rigid in his thinking that he sort of forced me away, really, I think. And now with my kids, then they're probably far more radical in their thoughts than I am. But I'm not trying to say to them, "You're wrong. Don't think that way." I just sort of think, well, that's I don't agree with everything you say, but I completely understand why you think that way. Which potentially could really annoy the hell out of them. but I sort of think, well, I wish I'd had more of that with my parents. And so in my late 20s, I say, I sort of made an effort, and I did start to kind of open up a little bit more to my mum and dad, not knowing at this time that my mum was actually already a little bit ill. She got cancer and then she died. And so she was a little bit preoccupied. I don't ever really feel that I didn't get as far with her as I would have liked. But we'd always been close. We'd always shared. She had a similar sense of humour to me, so we'd always bonded watching sitcom on TV. So we had that bond anyway. So it wasn't quite as combative really as it had been with my dad. But I decided I must try and be nicer to my dad. And I did try really hard. I felt I tried as hard as I could. He died, he was 80, so it was a long time later when he died. But I never felt that he had really, I never felt a bond, I never felt that we'd really understood each other. And it was only years later that I understood why, as my wife is a clinical psychologist, and she's a specialist in autism behavior. And, as soon as she met my dad, first thing she said was, he's autistic. And, she wouldn't say, she's not someone who would say that. She's an expert in the field. She really understands it. And it all started to fit into place, really. And that was, the sort of his last years and things. I mean, it was a gradual thing that she felt that.
Did that kind of help you understand a bit more about, in your younger years, that perhaps, you were never going to get that alignment because your father, had undiagnosed autism perhaps, and wasn't going to perhaps understand fully your views.
I mean, it took a bit longer even than even in those last years he was alive. I mean, I still didn't really, because I didn't really understand autism that well at that point. And it was still, even this was, in the late 90s, it was still a kind of very new thing. And people were starting to talk about autism in a way, that as a disorder, really. It was called autistic spectrum disorder. And, and obviously it takes time for these, when something relatively new comes forward, it takes time for people to find the language. So there was a period, really, I suppose, after he died when I really started to kind of properly understand it and feel a little bit more of a regret. Not a regret, because I think I felt I was doing everything I could to understand him, but I just felt more sad for him that he had never been able to be accepted by other people because of who he was, and that he was just. And I for all my kind of anger towards him and things, I did always feel very bad for him, because he was when we'd go and meet his dad, my grandparents, his mum and dad, they were quite horrible to him, really. They were sort of quite bullying to him. And I guess that was just years and years and years of, again, trying to understand parents. So I'm trying to understand his parents from his point of view. They had obviously tried to communicate with him and in a way that people communicate, and he never communicated with them. So they got more and more frustrated. And then similarly, with my mum's family, I think there was this extra thing anyway. They always felt they were slightly one generation more established in the Leeds community than my dad's family, and so they sort of looked down on him a bit. And it didn't help that socially he was just embarrassing at tea parties and meal times and things. So he's just very quiet or eccentric and things, and so he got sort of mocked and ridiculed by them as well. So I always felt very kind of upset on his behalf, but then I also was annoyed as hell by it. Yeah,
and I guess a lot of that's on generational historic ignorance on conditions, mental health conditions that we know about now. And there was only more ignorance the further back you go.
Yeah, absolutely. It was complete ignorance on my part as much as anyone else's. But weirdly, years and years later, his younger brother who is 10 years younger than him, but he got in touch with us about 10 years ago, and my wife and I had never discussed it with well, I'd sort of mentioned it to my siblings about, well, maybe he was autistic and things, but we hadn't really talked about it. But then my uncle, who very rarely stayed in touch with and had completely lost touch with, and he didn't have family or anything. He married someone when he was quite old and didn't have kids and things. But I mean, which was all fine and things. But he phoned us, and he was 60 by this point, and he said, "Oh, I've been talking to this person and telling them all about myself and everything." And he said, this person who was also an expert in autism, I said, "I can't give you a diagnosis." He said, "But you sound like an absolute textbook person with autism." My jaw dropped, because I thought he was going to ring me to talk about my dad and my dad being autistic. But he said, "No, that was me. I definitely was autistic." We chatted a bit, and then his wife came on the phone, and she said, "Let me talk to you about this, because I know I can tell you what it's like to live with someone who is autistic." She just reeled off all these things, and it was just both kids were autistic, but it just showed in a completely different way. He was much more. He was like ambitious, and he was driving, and he was a workaholic. He put all his energy into the work. So there are these two brothers at this family business, and as soon as the family business went bust, he went straight off and became solo sales rep, and he just kept working. My dad just went into a sort of fog of depression, and that's that. At the time, that looked to me as like, oh God, my dad is he's giving up. Whereas look at Uncle Tony, look, he hasn't given up. He's gone off. He's done this. He's done that. And I probably, on more than one occasion, will have probably used his brother to beat my dad over the head with the stick and say, "Look at him. Why can't you be, like when parents say to kids, why can't you be like him?"
And they were just opposite ends of the same spectrum.
Yeah. But him then saying, "Oh, I was autistic and I never knew," was just quite extraordinary, really. It was just a real shock. And he then talked about his mum, my grandmother, saying he talked about her in very Freudian terms. He said she was an ice queen. She was sort of cold, unloving. And my wife said that means she was autistic, and she probably was.
You can track it.
Yeah. So there's there's a lot of autism in that family.
I was just wondering about the the kind of perception that some comedians are the funniest people in the room, but perhaps the saddest behind closed doors, and that link between perhaps mental ill health or depression and comedy. But I don't know if there's what you think about whether there's truth in that, or whether that's just a bit of an old adage that doesn't really scrub up.
Again, it's one of those things that, and I mean, yes, when I grew up with it, and people say, "Oh, the sad clown," that kind of classic cliche. But it was interesting to me when I first started to do comedy, and I was, sort of doing quite well at it in my 20s, and I met quite a few people who I hadn't seen since my sort of teenage years, and I did some various sort of voluntary work, social work things, and also meeting up with old school people that I hadn't seen. And they would always go, you're a comedian, but, you're just such a quiet person, what? And I think, and this comes back to the autism thing. And I don't, this is the sort of thing that requires people to do studies, I think, because everything that I'm going to say now is completely anecdotal. But I would say that definitely there is a link in terms of people who are unable to relate socially in what might be called normal social situations, whether it's, with their families or, at school or just around what's considered normal, and they struggle to fit in and they don't open up at all. But when it comes to doing comedy, they can go up on stage and reveal their darkest selves to a room full of strangers. And I sort of started to think a little bit about that and autism, and thinking about how, well, a stand-up comedian's set is usually about 15 to 20 minutes. Autistic people like to talk, and they don't like other people to interrupt. And so, doing stand-up is like a 20-minute monologue. It's like perfect for being for someone with autism. Kind of not being able to shine in company, but to go up on stage and just say everything to a room full of strangers. And that also feels like a similar trait, I would suppose to say, with autism. And so, yeah, and I think also there is the sort of the neural pathways that don't follow the same sort of lines for people with autism, but can sometimes go down a very sort of counterintuitive route to what we would expect. And comedy jokes are just they are counterintuitive. They are surprises. They are things you're not expecting. And anyone who's spent any time with somebody who's got language who is autistic will say, yeah, they often just say things that you were not expecting to hear them say. So I do think there is a link there. I think rather than it being about sadness, although I do think I have known some comedians who have suffered with depression, I think, as well, or clinical depression. But I do also know a lot of comedians who have not necessarily been depressed, but have just found their way of communicating through doing stand-up, and has helped them, I think, as people.
That's interesting. I've spoken to a number of people doing this podcast, actually, who have written a book about their experiences and have found that in itself to be of great help so not standing up on stage, delivering a monologue, but writing down their experiences into a written form was a great help. So I wonder if there's a kind of perhaps a parity there or some sort of similarity.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure how useful necessarily I would say to someone, you should try stand up, because it is a sort of if you're not robust enough, and you go up there, and it's not necessarily hostility, it's indifference. That's the worst thing, because that's what most comedians suffer, I think, much more than being heckled, is when you say something and it doesn't get a laugh, and that's kind of, that's harder. But I think a lot of people try stand up, in very supportive situations, and I'm not sure that necessarily for somebody who feels like they are an outsider, what they might gain from being in a group of people, the aim of which is to kind of help you and give you more confidence speaking in public. It might be something. I suppose, yeah. I think the thing that's really worked for me more than anything is just, like I say, it's kind of trying to understand the people around me. And with that comes a kind of understanding, comes a self-awareness, and maybe a realization. And I think that's one of the things that most that we suffer from most, I think, is our lack of self-awareness. I think certainly the thing that I said a little bit earlier about looking at the relationships of people that you're very, very close to and really trying to see them from those people's points of view, and maybe start to find ways of talking to people that you've not necessarily, who are close to you, that you've not necessarily been able to establish what might be considered a normal relationship, and just see how much of it is you, and even if it isn't you, even if it is them, it's to be understanding of why they were like what they were. I mean, and I do think with my dad, it wasn't me, but then again, I can see how he was responding to me in the only way that he could, and I feel much more understanding of him. And I think I spent enough time with him before he died to feel that I had resolved that. And it is one of those things, start now, because, you just never know how long people are going to be around, really. So, do it today.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Thanks very much for your time. And
welcome.
Really good to talk to you. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. You can find out more about Dave's work as a comedian, comedy writer, novelist, and teacher of comedy writing on his website, www.davecohen.org.uk. If you have any questions about autism in the UK, you can visit the National Autistic Society's website, www.autism.org.uk. And in the US, you can visit the Autism Society of America's website, autismsociety.org. If you have a story to tell and you think your experience would help others, then please get in touch, either via the website, mid-lifemen.com, or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. Finally, please share the podcast with people you know and with your networks. If you've enjoyed listening, then please rate or like the podcast to help raise its profile and reach more people who might benefit from the stories shared by my guests.